Hi, I'm Liz from Night Owl Crafts Australia, and this is my able assistant Tosh. Today we're going to be looking at embossing and the different ways that you can emboss. With these cards I've used 4 different types of embossing techniques. The first card is done just using an embossing folder. This folder is Cable Knits by Stampin' Up. And in the next card I've used embossing using a wafer thin die, and this die is also from Stampin' Up Eastern Medallions die set. This die uses embossing powder, and the final card uses embossing paste. So we'll show each of those techniques next. To emboss using an embossing folder, you just put the paper into the folder, close it up, and then feed it through the Bigshot machine. I've got the Bigshot on tab 1 only with a cutting plate, then the embossing folder. And because this particular folder is fairly thick, rather than put the second cutting plate on top, I'm going to just use a shim to help it go through. And taking it out, we have a very detailed piece of card now to use as the card front. To emboss using a wafer thin die, you will need to use a silicone mat or a thin piece of foam underneath the die. So we've got the tab set on 1, the cutting plate, the silicone mat, the piece of paper, and then the die placed face down, so the cutting surface is face down onto the piece of paper. We'll then use the second cutting plate on top, and the silicone mat acts as a buffer to stop the die actually cutting its way through the paper. So here we have the raised or embossed surface on the card. One technique that you can use, and which I've used with this card, you can apply a light coating of Versamark ink or a clear embossing ink onto the surface of the die, and then put it onto the paper and pass it through. Once you've passed it through, it will transfer the Versamark ink onto the paper. You can then dust it with embossing powder and heat it with the heat gun, and you will get just the very finest of lines, like a gold thread, in the places where the Versamark has been attached to the card, and it just gives it a little bit more interest and glimmer. For this card I used embossing powder. I used the butterfly swallowtail stamp from Stampin' Up, Versamark ink, and applied the Versamark liberally to the stamp. It's a fairly large stamp, this one, and then applied it directly to the card, pressing down firmly so that all the surfaces come in contact with the card. and then applying the embossing powder. We'll use a bit of scrap paper underneath so that any extra powder can be collected and put back afterwards. And the powder will stick to wherever the ink was laid down. This particular black powder has a bit of sparkle in it as well. Just give it a good shake and then tap it off, making sure that all of the butterfly has powder covering it. Giving it a tap just to remove any excess, and if there's any little bits, just brush them away. Because this embossing powder has a bit of glitter in it, I'm going to heat it initially from underneath to stop the glitter from blowing out of place, because it will set on other parts of the card where the butterfly isn't, so leaving little black spots. If you heat it from underneath, that'll stop this from happening. Once it's begun to melt, I'll then finish it off by heating from the top. This is the final look of it once the embossing powder has melted. To the final card I added little dots of embossing ink and some gold embossing powder just to make the background more interesting. The final example of embossing uses embossing paste, and to do this you'll need a stencil and the embossing paste, and I'm using Stampin' Up embossing paste. So you place the stencil over the paper in whichever direction you want. Once you've positioned the stencil onto the paper, use washi tape or some similar type of not too tacky tape to hold it in place, because you don't want it moving while you're applying the paste. This particular stencil is a Tim Holtz stencil called Bubble. The embossing paste does dry very quickly. It comes out white. You can colour this either after you apply it or before, if you take some out and mix it with some ink. I'm just going to apply it white. And the idea is to smear it across the stencil. Don't work it back and forth, because you're likely then to get little bits of it going underneath the stencil. Avoid getting too thick a layer, because when it dries it will warp the paper if it is too thick. Any excess can be put back in the jar for later use. And any equipment that you've used to apply the paste needs to go into soapy water, because it dries quite hard and you don't want to end up scraping it off your equipment. The stencil, just place it into the hot soapy water as well for ease of cleanup later. If I'd been a little bit more careful, I would have avoided getting excess down the side there, but I can wipe that away, or I can cut it and cut the little bit off at the side when I'm getting it ready to apply to the card. Leave this for 3 to 4 minutes to dry completely. If you wish, before it dries, you can put glitter over it. Once it's dry, you can also apply ink over the top of it, which was what I've done in this card using different coloured inks. There's a huge variety of stencils out there, and you will find that it adds quite a lot of interest to your card, as well as an interesting surface to feel. So now you can see that there's more than one way to emboss. I hope you give some of these techniques a try in making your cards or scrapbook pages. This has been Liz from Night Owl Crafts Australia with my able assistant Tosh, and I hope you remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel. See you next time. Taking it out, we've now got a very detailed and
a very detailed and please explain what an is.
Once you've got the stencil on the paper, use a little bit of Once you've got the stencil on the paper, use a little bit of